On the 17th of July, 1940, the 2nd Division departed Tripoli, headed for the Aegean Sea, where they would sail north of Crete, and then they would arrive at Portolago 2 days later on the 19th, where they would be better positioned to attack British convoys. The 2nd Squadron would be under the command of Rear Admiral Fernando Casarde aboard his flagship Giovanni dalla Bande Nere. Following the 2nd Squadron's flagship was the Bartolomeo Colleoni, with Captain Umberto Novero in command. Unknown to the Italians, the Royal Navy would also be active north of Crete on the 19th of July, in the very area that the 2nd Squadron was intended to pass. The 2nd Flotilla, consisting of the destroyers Hyperion, Ilex, Hero, and Hasty, were to conduct anti-submarine warfare in the channel between Queso and Crete. Meanwhile, the Australian cruiser Sydney, along with the destroyer Havoc, were to search the Gulf of Athens in order to prepare the area for a convoy that was intended to depart Egypt. There were also a further 8 destroyers positioned in the South Aegean Sea, where 2 convoys were intended to pass one another, one sailing from Egypt and another sailing from the Dardanelles. At 6 a.m. on the 19th of July, the 2nd Squadron entered the channel between Crete and Serigoto, zigzagging at a speed of 25 knots. At this very moment, while the weather was in unfavorable conditions, causing heavy seas and fog, the Italian cruisers spotted the 4 destroyers of the 2nd Flotilla at a distance of approximately 17,000 meters off the bow. At the same time, the 2nd Flotilla also spotted the Italians, and they radioed their position, stating they had found the enemy. As a result, they began to sail northeast, which is where the Sydney and Havoc were located, sailing on a northerly course at a distance of about 60 miles. After receiving contact with the Italians, the Sydney and Havoc altered their course to the south, closing the distance between themselves and the 2nd Flotilla. Rear Admiral Casarde believed that the 4 destroyers were an advance escort for an active convoy, and as a result, he began to chase the destroyers, believing that they were leading him towards a convoy. At 6:27 a.m., using the forward battery of the 152mm guns, the Italian cruisers opened fire at a range of 17,000 meters, and the cruisers increased speed to 32 knots. The British destroyers also attempted to return fire. However, the Italians were outside of their main battery firing ranges, and so all of their shells fell short. At 6:43, the 2nd Flotilla launched a barrage of torpedoes, but due to the extreme range, those also missed. After launching their torpedoes, the British destroyers began to run at full speed and laid a smokescreen, and as a result at 6:50, the Italians lost visual contact and they ceased firing. As a result, Rear Admiral Casarde ordered the 2nd Division to alter course slightly to starboard in order to regain visual contact and hopefully bring the British destroyers slightly closer into range, as altering to starboard was a convergent course. A few minutes later, visual contact was regained, but by that point, the destroyers had opened the range to 23,000 meters, which was at the maximum end of the Italian cruisers' firing, and while they did attempt to fire a few salvos, they all fell short. The weather continued to deteriorate, and as a result, the fog densened and decreased visual range, and as a result, the Italian commanders discussed launching reconnaissance aircraft, but opted against it as they would have to slow down, and the weather was considered too dangerous. This decision would be fatal as it left the Italians blind, but they continued sailing on, and at 7:30, a salvo of medium-caliber shells fell around the leading ship, Bandanera. HMAS Sydney had arrived, and, using the dense fog to its advantage, opened fire at a range of 12,000 meters to the Italians' port side. Sydney would quickly land a shell on the Bandanera's after funnel, and as a result, the 2nd Division altered course 90 degrees to starboard and opened fire on the Sydney with their 2 after turrets. At the same time, the 2nd Flotilla altered course, headed for Sydney and Havoc, where all 6 of the Allied ships would join together in one formation. The Australian and British ships began to chase the 2nd Division, and the Italian fire was greatly inaccurate due to being unable to see the targets. However, Sydney's return fire was far more accurate, and though it wasn't scoring hits, the salvos were falling dangerously close to the cruisers. During this exchange of fire, Unknown to the Italians, they actually scored one 6-inch hit, which struck the Sydney in the after funnel, causing virtually no damage. As a result of Sydney's relative accuracy, the Italians decided to lay a smokescreen and break off contact, which temporarily resulted in firing from both sides being suspended. Once when the smokescreen cleared, the Italians had opened the distance to 19,000 meters. At 7:53, Rear Admiral Casarde ordered his cruisers to alter their course south and make an attempt to run for Cape Spada, though the Sydney would remain in hot pursuit. Firing between the two sides would resume. However, the Italians would remain inaccurate, as heavy seas resulted in the ships pitching and rolling heavily, which resulted in fire control having trouble spotting the fall of shot, meaning they could not make proper adjustments to their aim. At 8:24 a.m., the Italians had steamed 5 miles beyond Cape Spada and were rounding Cape Camaros when the Colleoni was struck by an accurate salvo from Sydney. One of Sydney's 6-inch shells would strike Colleoni in its steering mechanism, jamming the rudder in a central position, resulting in the cruiser being on a dead straight course. Now having the range, Sydney fired another salvo, which accurately landed within the forward superstructure of Colleoni, striking the conning tower and killing many of the bridge personnel. As a result, the Colleoni began to lose speed, and the 5 British destroyers began to catch up. Once they were within range, the British destroyers opened fire and quickly struck the after boiler room, destroying boilers 5 and 6, and also destroying the main steam collector, which starved the boilers of water, resulting in the ship losing power, and it steadily drifted to a stop. Having lost power, the Colleoni was unable to operate its main battery, and as a result, it could only return fire with its secondary 10-centimeter guns. The British and Australians continued to fire relentlessly at the now stationary cruiser, and within 6 minutes, they reduced it to a burning hulk. At 8:30, realizing the severity of the situation, the now wounded Captain Navarro ordered his cruiser to be abandoned. At the same time, the destroyers Ilex and Havoc, having closed to extreme close range, launched a salvo of torpedoes at the Colleoni. One torpedo would find its mark just ahead of the number 1 15-centimeter main battery turret, blowing off approximately 30 meters of the ship's bow. At approximately 8:50, the Hyperion launched a torpedo, which struck the Colleoni amidships on the starboard side, resulting in excessive flooding, which caused the Colleoni to capsize to starboard and sink by the bow. The Havoc, Ilex, and Hyperion steamed to where the Colleoni had sunk and began to collect survivors, gathering a total of 525, of which 93 were wounded and 8 would later die, being buried at sea. A further 4 would die upon arrival at port, which included Captain Umberto Navarro. Approximately 50 sailors would be left at sea, either refusing to be rescued by the British, or they were left in the sea after Italian bombers dropped bombs on the British destroyers, causing them to flee the scene. As a result, a total of 4 officers, 17 non-commissioned officers, and 100 petty officers and sailors died during the engagement and its immediate aftermath. Of the 4 sailors who died after reaching port, which included Captain Navarro, they would be buried at Alexandria with full honors. Their pallbearers would be made up of officers from the 6 ships that had attacked them. This included Captain Collins from the HMAS Sydney. The Battle of Cape Spada is largely forgotten, and for the most part is probably considered to be insignificant. However, this was a major step in the Royal Navy in protecting the convoys of the Mediterranean during the opening months of the Second World War. This was also the battle that encapsulated the first sinking of an Italian light cruiser during the war, which in its own respect is a significant achievement. With that having been said, I have nothing more to add on to this video for today. So, if you have learned something new, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.